Now, what we're going to do, we're going to bring in my good friend, Vanessa Davies, and she's been very active in the Egyptology community, speaking about these African origins in ancient Egypt. Vanessa, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Great, great. We are so happy to have you on. As you know, I've been watching your work for a very, very long time, and I've very much appreciated the hard work that you're doing in trying to restore true Egyptology, so to speak. So why don't we take a moment and tell us about your journey to becoming an Egyptologist?
Sure. Well, first, let me thank you for saying that. I really appreciate your support in what I'm doing. I came to Egyptology really through sort of hitting modern Egypt first. When I went to college, I started studying Arabic right away, and I studied Arabic all throughout my college career and afterwards. And I went to Egypt to do a study abroad trip to really immerse myself in the language. I was living in Cairo. I was going to college there, and I fell in love with Egypt. I love it as a country, and so I was studying it. I was really focusing on Islamic studies and the modern Middle East. And eventually, after college, Egypt kept calling me back. I would go back there whenever I could, and eventually it sort of occurred to me, I need to just focus on Egypt alone, not the Middle East in general, not North Africa in general, but really focus in on Egypt. And so I decided to make this transition from studying the Islamic era to studying the ancient culture of Egypt. So that's how I arrived at Egyptology.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. That is amazing. Now, as I've, researched you and studied some of the things that you write, and you even sent me an article that's on iblackpharaoh.com, so make sure you guys go check out Vanessa's article that I copied some of it and put it up on iblackpharaoh.com because I greatly appreciated what you talked about W.E.B. Du Bois. And you're one of the few Egyptologists that talk about these African origins of ancient Egypt or Kemet. How did you come to that conclusion? Because that's not really a popular Egyptology theory, so to speak.
Yeah, it's an odd and sad fact. I mean, for me personally, it never really occurred to me that it was anything other than African. I always saw Egypt as African, and so it really wasn't until maybe my second or third year of graduate school that I even understood that there was a group of people that would think that it was not part of Africa, and that was pretty shocking to me. And really, I think that's what led me to the work I'm doing today, because it was shocking, not in a good way, and I felt like I needed to be a voice against that perspective to really place Egypt in its African context. And I would say there are certainly other Egyptologists who are doing this work that I'm doing, and they are strong allies and friends and colleagues of mine. There are a lot of Egyptologists who are really kind of silent on the issue, and that silence isn't a great thing, I think, especially in the world that we're living in today. So I think what you would find if you sort of looked at Egyptology with a broad view is a lot of people just not talking about this, period.
Right. There's this theory that Nubia, and I watched one of your videos on YouTube with Brother Kiata, and where it was mentioning how Nubia was considered to be the black part of North Africa, and then you have ancient Kemet as the white part of ancient Egypt. Now, when would you say, I have my own personal theory on this, but when would you say that ancient Kemet, land of the blacks, or the black land, or the fertile land, or whatever they want to call it, when did Kemet become Egypt in your assumption?
So when you say that, you don't mean like when did they stop using the word Kemet? You mean when did it stop being considered part of a larger African cultural framework? Is that what you mean?
Yes, the second.
Okay, the second. So that's a hard one, I think, to pinpoint specifically, although I can talk about it just in terms of Egyptology as an academic discipline. So a lot of the early white European and American Egyptologists who worked in Egypt in the 19th century were coming at the study of ancient Egypt from a background of biblical studies, and some of them were funded by societies that were biblical studies societies. And so there was a great interest in understanding Egypt in its biblical context, right? And so many excavations were geared towards finding ancient settlements that were mentioned in the Bible, and finding proof through archaeology of the biblical stories, and finding evidence of these ancient cultures that are talked about in the Bible. And so because of this perspective of coming at it from the angle of the Bible, there was a real move to make Egypt part of the sort of white Western sphere. That was the perspective of the majority of the Egyptologists at that time. And you can see this in their publications. So, for instance, there was a professor, the first Egyptologist at the University of Chicago was James Henry Breasted, and a particular book that he wrote a huge number of books, but one of the books that he wrote actually has an incredibly racist map in it that he drew, and the map labels Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, including Egypt. It labels it the Great White Race. And then the area below that, so from a particular line of latitude in Africa, below that he labels the Black Race. And so that's a sort of easy thing for me to point to show people what this perspective was of some of these very early Egyptologists. And he wasn't the only one who felt this way. And it really was coming from the fact that they were trying to draw Egypt out of its African context into this biblical context. Now, I should say also that was their educational background. They understood the Bible. They often, for instance, like knew ancient Hebrew. They were coming at this from that angle. They didn't know African history, right? They had no knowledge of other ancient African cultures, and that was and still is, in my opinion, a deficit in our Western educational system. So they couldn't understand Egypt in its African context because they didn't know anything outside of Egypt and Nubia. They simply had no idea. So would you? That's kind of a long answer.
That's a good answer. It's a good answer. And to say that is almost like saying that they looked at Egypt from somewhat of a European perspective, instead of looking at it, which has a lot of shared traditions with people like Nubia, people like other African nations, very similar traditions in Central Africa especially, and even in ancient Mali. So would you say that they looked at Egypt from a more European perspective instead of having a little bit more of a diversity?
That's exactly what I'm saying, yes, that they had no knowledge of any of those ancient cultures, like, for instance, of Mali that you mentioned. And so they literally couldn't draw any connections between ancient Egypt and Nubia and the rest of Africa because they simply didn't know what those connections might be.
Right. Now, you mentioned that there's some of your colleagues that know some other Egyptologists. Can you just, for our listeners, could you just mention a few that agree with the Egypt's African origins, just so our listeners know?
Sure, absolutely. So some people who have been doing this work for decades now and who actually reside in departments of Africana Studies, which is where I think all Egyptologists should reside, but they don't all reside. But some of those people are, for instance, Melissa Asante at Temple University, Malana Karenga at Cal State Long Beach, Theophila Benga, who is now retired, used to be at San Francisco State. There are other, Sheikh Anta is the big one, of course. He's now deceased. But Alain Anselin, who just recently died very, very young. My colleague Shamar Takeda, who you mentioned, who is fantastic, has been doing this work for decades. My friends and colleagues Sally Ann Ashton, Solange Ashby, Deborah Hurd, Tristan Samuels, who's a graduate student at Temple. And so those are just the people I'm coming up with off the top of my head, but there are people doing this work, and I think our voices are getting louder.
Right. Sheikh Anta Diop, shout out to him. Shout out to Ivan Van Sertima as well. I learned a lot from Van Sertima. Yeah, a lot of great Egyptologists. And Sally will also be on the show next week for all the listeners, so we'll have her perspective as the Kemet expert. And, in talking about this.
Can I throw one? Sorry, can I just throw one more in there? Because so I just want to give a shout out to the people. These people who I'm talking about now are all deceased, but people who maybe didn't consider themselves Egyptologists, but were doing this work. And that's like, for instance, you mentioned my article about W.B. Du Bois. Du Bois, in one of his books, he even says, I'm not an Egyptologist. That goes without saying. And then he lists a hugely long list of all of the Egyptologists whose work he's written and whose work he's responding to. He was doing a lot of work throughout the 20th century to argue that Egypt was an African culture. And to my mind, he was an Egyptologist because he knew these scholars' work, he was doing the work, but he didn't consider himself one. But he's one. Marcus Garvey is one who was making this argument. There were other people involved with this work who aren't seen by the world as being Egyptologists and maybe didn't consider themselves Egyptologists, but they were with us in this fight also.
Right. And I also want to give another shout out to someone who was very supportive in the I Black Pharaoh movement, and that's Robert Duvall. He was another one, who spoke, who definitely spoke a lot of good, positive things. He came up with, him and Thomas Brophy came out with that book, Black Genesis. Very excellent book, by the way, for the listeners as well. So now you started to talk about the African origins. Did you face any harsh feedback? Because I can know from my own perspective, but I even just showed the cover because the guy that we used for the cover, he's a Sudanese guy of I Black Pharaoh, and I faced so much hatred, hate mail. Egyptians weren't black, stop blackwashing Egypt, you're a liar, you're this, you're that. So did you face any of that type of backlash or harsh feedback from your stance on ancient Egypt?
So yes, but interestingly, I haven't received any harsh feedback from Egyptologists. When I go around and I give talks on this subject, the Egyptologists who've been in the audience of my talks are very receptive, and they think that this is really important work and that I need to keep forging ahead with it. But I have gotten negative feedback, especially over email, from Egyptians. So it's an interesting conundrum where there are some Egyptians who will tell me, these are people I don't know, who are just finding out how to contact me and send me an email and say, what you're doing is wrong. The ancient Egyptian culture was not a black culture. Modern Egyptians are not black people. What you're doing is dangerous. You need to stop saying this, which of course I'm not going to stop saying this. And I try to explain what my work is about. And I also try to explain, our perspective in America on what black is different from a lot of the rest of the world. And so I try to explain our American context of that word. But yeah, I've definitely gotten some harsh feedback. I'm sorry to hear that you have as well.
Yeah, and it's also from Egyptians as well, modern day Egyptians. What people fail to understand, Vanessa, is that Egypt was a mega civilization. And over time, there were migrations, there were invasions of many different people coming from the Middle East, coming from Europe, coming from even below Egypt in certain parts of Africa that came into Egypt and mixed and mingled throughout the years. So I think people tend to forget that there were lots of takeovers after the Persians, after the 31st or 32nd dynasty was a Persian, and then it was the Greeks and then the Romans after. But people seem to forget that, and mostly that I get that feedback from Cairo more than I would say Aswan. So I feel you on that.
That's interesting.
Yep, that's where I seem to get most of, the harsh critics from. So obviously you face challenges as an Egyptologist. You said you didn't get any type of negative feedback from Egyptologists, correct?
Yeah, so far I have not. And it could be that my audience for my talks is self-selecting. It could be that the people who disagree with what I'm saying don't come to my talk. So we can't rule that out. But all I'm saying is, the people who have given me feedback are very supportive.
Now, there was a few different DNA tests that tried to eliminate this conversation in regard. I believe it was one in 2012 and another one in 2016. One specifically was about 150 mummies that were tested, and they were found that a very high percentage, I don't know the exact number, I don't have it here in front of me, but a very high percentage of these DNA tests came back to be more European and the rest was Mediterranean, and a very, very small percentage to be Sub-Saharan African. How do you feel about those DNA tests, and do you think those particular ones were accurate, or did they have some sort of malice attached to them?
Yeah, so I have a serious problem with this particular article that came out in the journal Nature Communications. It came out, like maybe 3 years ago. And yes, you're correct. That's what they argued is that the ancient populations. Well, I don't want to repeat their argument. I will tell you the problems I have with their article. Number one, their sample size that they used, the extracted DNA, the sample size is so small, it was essentially 3 complete genomes. That's it. So it's 3 people's complete genome sequence. And from that sample of 3 people, they extrapolated to the entire population of what we now call Egypt, for the entire range of ancient Egyptian history, which is thousands of years. So they made way overly broad claims based on a very, very, very small sample size from one little site. That's it. One site, 3 people, and they were making these grand conclusions. Like you can't do that. That's irresponsible science. And then, of course, it was picked up by all these news outlets, and their faulty conclusions were repeated in regular news outlets as if it was fact, and that is just wrong. And so that is one of the things I've been fighting against, and my colleague Shamar Takeda, who is a biological anthropologist, and so he can really dig deep on the genetic arguments in a way that I cannot because I don't have that background. But he and I are just a couple of the people who have been fighting against this. Also, Jean-Philippe Gourdin and Jean-Luc Gourdin have been doing a lot of work because this is very damaging. This is, at its core, it's a racist argument, but it's very, very damaging.
And funny you say that as well. It is, because from what I've come to understand about that particular one in 2016 is that the samples of these DNA samples came from a predominantly Roman province and a Roman time. So I didn't think that was going to prove anything really about the ancient Egyptian origins as well. So it was a lot of just different things that were thrown out there as possibly why this stuff was faulty. But I just question that, and I just, when people ask me about it, it's so much inaccuracy that I can point out that I just leave that one alone. Okay, so now, now obviously we know that Egypt is like in the middle. There's the Mediterranean there, and then below Egypt is Nubia, or some would call Kush. The Bible calls Kush. What would you say was that relationship? Some people say that Kush or Nubia predated Egypt and was probably a predecessor to it as well.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was, it was complicated in the way that relationships between large groups of people often is, right? It was very mixed. It depends on, what sources you're looking at, what time period you're looking at. They were super interconnected. And I and some other Egyptologists as well like to think of this more as like Nile River Valley cultures. So rather than here's Egypt, it's separate from Nubia. No, they were very interconnected. And the Nile was the central connecting force between them. So there was a tremendous amount of cultural transmission back and forth between them. There was trade, there was, intermarriage. There were people from, say, Nubia working in Egypt, people from Egypt living and working in Nubia. And there was warfare, of course, between them. So that's what I mean when I say it's complex, right? It's everything from trade to work to marriage to war, in the way that so many human populations interact over long spans of time. And there were certain periods when Egyptian kings, went into Nubia with armies and conquered large areas and built Egyptian temples, had settlements, etc. And there was a time period, the Dynasty 25 is the big example of when Nubians went north and conquered Egypt and were ruling Egypt. So there was really a give and take in terms of power at its highest levels even.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the articles that was brought up. Black Pharaohs, conquerors of ancient Egypt. The 25th dynasty is what National Geographic printed as the only, quote unquote, only black side of ancient Egypt was when the Nubians conquered, and we see that that's not true. What would you say was your favorite dynasty of ancient Egypt?
Well, in terms of history, like my work focuses predominantly on the history of dynasties 18 and 19. So in terms of digging deep into the lives of people and the historical events as they're recorded, 18th and 19th dynasty is my favorite. But I work a lot on art. And just aesthetically speaking, I really like the art of the First Intermediate period, which is basically dynasties 7 through 11. And I like that art because the way that humans are depicted in First Intermediate period art, the way that hieroglyphs are drawn in First Intermediate period art, it looks different from any other era of Egyptian art. The way that bodies are drawn, it's not a usual rendering of a human form. You might have a person who has like a head that seems too large for their body, or their shoulders may be so broad they sort of look like a linebacker, or their hands are enormous compared to the rest of their body. And I like that. It's visually appealing to me. So just from an aesthetic perspective, yeah, I like the First Intermediate period art.
I'm going to say for me, I really like the 18th dynasty, not just because I wrote about Hatshepsut and Tutmosis III and Tutmosis II, but I feel the 18th dynasty, I personally believe it's very well interconnected with the Exodus story as well. I just loved Hatshepsut. I loved, we hear so much about Cleopatra and sometimes the mystery of Nefertiti, but we don't really get to hear so much about Hatshepsut. And this was a woman who ruled pretty much the world, the known world, for 20 long years. You know, the longest queen pharaoh to have that type of extended reign. I found that to be very interesting. And of course, Tutmosis the third, which was this great warrior pharaoh, which I really admired him as well. So 18th would be mine. So okay, so into that, we talked briefly a little bit about biblical studies. How would you say biblical studies fits into Egyptology, if it does at all, in modern day?
Less so than in the 19th century, early 20th century. I would say there are very few Egyptologists today who are doing their work in Egypt hoping to find proof of biblical stories in the way that they did, like I say, in the 19th and early 20th century. There's still some that might be coming from that perspective, but very, very few.
Okay.
So less than in the past. I will say, though, that scholars who are in the realm of biblical studies are still very interested in Egypt. So I had written something a while back on a peace treaty, an Egyptian peace treaty, and there were a lot of biblical studies scholars who were very interested in that work of mine. So from my perspective, the interest is coming, like biblical studies people are interested in Egypt, but I think there are far fewer Egyptologists who are looking to biblical studies. Does that make sense? It's not exactly a two-way street.
Yeah, it does, because, obviously Egypt is now more of a Islamic state now than it probably was back then, but it does make sense why it wouldn't at this particular point. Now, the ancient Greeks, they tend to be to give a lot of vital proof to this African origin of ancient Egypt. And from your studies, what was the perception? You have Hippocrates, you have Herodias, you have Achilles, you have a bunch of different names who've said things that suggest that these people, these ancient Egyptians, were no different from the quote-unquote Ethiopians or Ethiopians. What would you say was the Greeks' perception of ancient Kemet?
Yeah, so that's super interesting, I think. So the Greek-speaking people were certainly aware, of course, of Egypt and Ethiopia. I mean, when they say Ethiopia, they don't mean, of course, modern Ethiopia, the country. They're really talking about like Nubia, the Sudan, the Nile River Valley south of Egypt. So they were aware of those areas. They were aware of the people who lived in those areas, and they were aware that the people who lived in those areas looked different from the way that they did as Greek speakers. In Greek texts, Egypt is typically talked about as being a much older culture, more ancient than the Greek culture. It's a place of knowledge, a kind of source of knowledge. The Egyptians are sort of renowned in the ancient world in general for their medical knowledge. But when you look at, for instance, Greek vases from, like, say, the mid-5th century, the 6th century, you can find depictions of Greeks with people from the Nile River Valley, and you'll see that they are depicted differently. And in the text, they are described as looking different. And it's interesting. So I was just reading something on this morning. A short article came out online on a website. It was written by a classicist who lives in the UK, a guy named Tim Whitmarsh. And he was actually talking about this from his perspective as a classicist, and he said some really interesting things that I didn't know, which is, for instance, the colors, the words for colors in ancient Greek that we might, translate into English to fit our color scheme, it's not an easy plug and play. They don't necessarily easily translate to our colors. So like, for instance, if you're looking at a text that talks about someone's skin color, you can't just assume that what you're reading in English was that really meant that in the Greek. So the example he pulls out is green, okay? And he says, okay, so the word that we translate as green, the Greeks use that, to talk about vegetation, which makes sense to us, right? But they also use that same color to talk about sand, to talk about tears, to talk about blood. And that's like super fascinating because we don't think of blood as being green.
Right.
So things like that, like you have to keep in mind when you're looking at like a color description of a person. It doesn't necessarily translate to colors that we have. And the Greeks did not think of themselves as white. I mean, like, first of all, let me say the sort of racialized thinking that we have in our world didn't exist in this part of the ancient world. So they weren't thinking, the Greeks, the Egyptians, none of them were thinking about people in terms of racial classification. But, I mean, people understood that people had ranges of different skin colors, right? But the Greeks didn't think of themselves as white. They actually, there's a text that this author, this classicist I mentioned, referred to, where this group of Greeks traveling through Turkey encountered a group of people in Turkey who they thought were so odd because they were white, which indicates that the Greeks didn't think of themselves as white. So for certain modern racialized thinking that says, oh, the Greeks were a white civilization, they didn't consider themselves white, right? And they knew that the people of the Nile River Valley were darker skinned than they were, that looked differently than they did. They depicted them differently on vases from themselves. So it's fascinating to look at that ancient evidence of how people saw each other in relation to other people.
Exactly. And there's a good book on that called Black Athena. I don't know if you've ever read that. That talks about a lot of different, a mixed race of the Mediterranean that the ancient Greeks were, so to speak. So if you haven't, you should check that book out. It's pretty good.
That was super important for both the fields of classics and Egyptology. That book had an enormous impact on those fields.
Now, there's this situation to remove, and a lot of people have blamed it, even I've been guilty of saying or blaming it on Egyptology as a whole, the mission to remove Egypt from Africa. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, so some of that is what I mentioned earlier, where some of the very early 20th century Egyptologists who were white Europeans or white Americans, we're definitely sort of in essence doing that, like with the map that I mentioned published. And also I should say that in modern Egyptology today, we don't do enough work acknowledging that sort of racist and also colonialistic background of our own discipline. I mean, we should really be acknowledging that, yes, this is the roots of our academic discipline, and we do not stand alongside those roots anymore, but we acknowledge that was part of our academic history. I think, one thing that would be wonderful, in my opinion, like I said earlier, is if there was greater dialogue between Egyptology and the field of Africana studies. Because if you look in most universities today, Africana studies will focus on, different parts of Africa. It might be ancient, it might be more modern, but rarely do you find an Egyptologist in an Africana studies department. And I think that's a real shame. That could go a long way to basically putting Egypt back in Africa. It needs to be in those departments.
And it's really interesting about the separation from first taking it out of Africa, put it in Europe, and then they put it into the Middle East. Hopefully they put it back in Africa soon. But would you consider ancient Egypt to be ancient Black history?
Yes, I do. And it boggles my mind that people would not. It's not a question for me. Yes, absolutely. It is a part of Black history.
Now Valley civilization, there has been some uproar, and there's been some things going on in the world today. And do you think Nile Valley civilization in its African context should be a part of our school curriculum for the youth to see themselves, and our Africans or the African diaspora to see themselves in their textbooks in ancient times? Do you think that's something that should happen?
Absolutely. And I would say not just Nile Valley cultures, but other ancient cultures of Africa as well. Yes, absolutely, this should be part of young people's curriculum. I know, curricula, of course, differ from state to state, and it differs whether you're in a public school or a private school. I didn't receive a good education in school about ancient Africa in any part of Africa. I have friends who say that they did learn such things in school, and absolutely, I think every school should be teaching this.
Right. Now, there was, you talked about that intermediate period in ancient Egypt, where there was a group of Asiatics that had conquered ancient Egypt, and they were known as the Shepherd Kings, called by the Egyptians, also known as the Hyksos. Can you tell us a little bit about what you know about the Hyksos?
Sure. So we get this word Hyksos from the ancient Egyptian. What the ancient Egyptian called these people was Heka Hasut, which meant foreign rulers. So they were perceived as not Egyptian, right? They were foreign. What they were is sort of like generically, let's say, Asiatic. When we look at their personal names, we see that they're Semitic personal names. So they were from that region of Asia, which is very close to Egypt, right? So what we might now call the Middle East, where Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, that sort of region, where they were originally from specifically in that region, we can't say. But somewhere in that sort of Eastern Mediterranean region, they came to Egypt, settled in Egypt, had a large concentration of people in a town in the eastern delta of Egypt, which is called Avaris. And they settled there at some point during the Middle Kingdom. And when the sort of central power structure of Egypt was weakening, was breaking down, the Hyksos, or some of the Hyksos anyway, took the opportunity to seize some power for themselves. And so when you look at modern lists of Egyptian kings, Dynasty 15 is a Hyksos dynasty. So those are people whose ancestry was not always Egyptian, although they may have been in Egypt for quite a few generations by that point, who were ruling a pretty large portion of Egypt, and were styling themselves as Egyptian kings. So culturally, were taking on the cultural trappings of power that already existed within Egypt.
Mm-hmm. And that era would end with the Pharaoh Amos, who would restore the native Egyptian and expel the Hyksos out of ancient Egypt. And there's a famous passage by Hatshepsut. She says, "I have restored what was thrown down by the Asiatics." So we can tell that there was some sort of disdain for the Hyksos throughout Egyptian history after that 15th dynasty that you talked about. What would you say? There's there's a lot of questions, and I've heard different perspectives from some Afrocentric individuals. And what would you say was the earliest European civilization? I've been told it was the Hittites, but I'm not too sure about that. What would you say was the earliest European civilization?
Just the earliest period?
Well, let's say the earliest that made contact with ancient Kemet. Let's go there.
Okay. The earliest I can think of is what we call in Egyptology, sort of generically, we call them like Aegean Islanders. What I suspect they were, what most Egyptologists suspect they were Minoans. So the Minoan culture, which was based on the island of Crete and some other islands in the Mediterranean, we have evidence of that Minoan culture in Egypt. And we think that they equate to people called Keftiu. So that's what we think the ancient Egyptian word for these Minoan people were. There's some people who would argue with me on that, but most people would say, yeah, the Keftiu are Minoan. And they show up in tomb art. We have physical evidence of them. So at that site of Avaris that I mentioned, where the Hyksos power base was, there are some frescoes there at Avaris that are actually dating to the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III that are Minoan style artwork. They're absolutely not Egyptian art at all. When you look at them, it's totally Minoan. So now who the artists were is a question. Like, were these actual Minoans in Avaris making these frescoes, or were these Egyptians in Avaris or Hyksos in Avaris? Well, the Hyksos were gone by then, so probably let's just say Egyptians. Mimicking the style of Minoan art. We can't say exactly who the artists were, but we can look at the art and say, oh, that is definitely Minoan. And there's some other physical evidence. There was a queen, Ahotep, from Dynasty 17, and in her burial was an axe that had a particular motif on the axe that is Minoan. It was a griffin, which is not an Egyptian artistic motif at all, but it is Minoan. So there must have been some sort of contact during her lifetime. So yeah, that's the earliest I can think of.
Okay, we got some text coming in, and there's been a lot of questions that I'm not even going to ask, but there are two here that I do think are somewhat interesting. And the first one is about Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, obviously she's probably referring to Cleopatra the Seventh. What would you say is, we hear a lot that Cleopatra was Greek. What would you say that Cleopatra was in her ethnicity? Would you say that she was half Egyptian, half Greek? Would you say she was 100% Greek? What would you say on that?
So, culturally speaking, her family had been living in Egypt for generations. So culturally, she was Egyptian of a ruling class. So let's just say that the culture of the ruling class might be very different from the culture of, say, a laboring class, right? So she was culturally Egyptian of a ruling class. Now, her family, as you probably know, is a ruling family. There was a lot of sort of intermarriage, brothers, sisters, nieces, uncles, that kind of thing. So their heritage, which was originally, they were Macedonian Greeks, right? Her heritage was originally, yes, Macedonian Greek. Her grandmother, it's a strong possibility that her grandmother was native Egyptian, so not of this Macedonian Greek community. So yeah, I think it's a definite possibility that she literally had some Egyptian DNA, let's say, despite the fact that her family had been intermarrying for generations. But culturally, definitely Egyptian ruling class.
Okay. The other question here from one of our listeners that I found interesting, let me pull it back up. There is now, I'm not saying this because I don't know this. There is significant evidence that Narmer was from Central Africa. Have you ever heard that?
So, no, not that specifically, but what I have heard and what I find super fascinating is the idea that some of the imagery that you see on the Narmer palette, like for instance the bull's tail that Narmer wears, and the bull's tail remains a sort of visual element of kingship throughout Egyptian history. So that bull's tail, there are arguments that iconography is coming from somewhere south of Egypt in Africa, whether it's along the Nile River Valley or perhaps further to the west. So I'm aware of arguments about iconography on the Narmer palette coming from further south in Africa, and I love those arguments. I would like to see people flesh them out a little bit more. I'd love to have more evidence to make it a stronger argument. But yeah, in terms of Narmer as a human being, we don't have, as far as I know, any evidence of where he was from, like, for instance, where he was born.
Okay, good. Now, another one was, and I've heard this so many times, it's funny to me, but I wouldn't say this thought, Vanessa, is far-fetched. This is the last question I'm going to ask you. Would you say it was possible for the people of ancient Egypt or Kemet to have conducted electricity in those days?
So I think where this question is coming from is there was a special on TV, I cannot remember the name of the show, that argued this. And they pointed to a particular relief in I can't remember if it was in a temple, but I can't remember which temple it was. And they claimed, to say that, oh, this is an image of a light bulb, and this is proof that the ancient Egyptians had the power of electricity. I don't believe that. I mean, as someone who studies art history, I look at that particular relief, and it's a flower. It's kind of like oblong shaped, like a light bulb is, but it's not a light bulb, and I don't think there's any proof that the ancient Egyptians conducted electricity.
Mm-hmm. I think I saw something on Ancient Aliens on the History Channel about the Pyramid of Giza having such high voltage at the peak of it. I don't know how true it is that they thought possibly that there was somewhat of a bulb on top of it, on top of some of these pyramids. That's what I had heard. I have never done any advanced study into it, but that's as far as I know on that for the listener.
That's interesting. I had not heard that. I stay away from the Ancient Alien shows because, to my mind, this is yet another way to take this ancient history away from Africa. Because now you're saying, oh, Africans didn't have the ability to, build these pyramids, to have this culture. It must have been aliens. Like, no, right. That is as racist as some of the other things we were talking about earlier. Like, exactly. No, this was an African culture. So I don't even watch those shows for that reason.
Exactly. They say, nope, Africans didn't do it. It was the same thing in ancient Zimbabwe, ancient Benin, ancient Mali, that there were some other nations that came in and built these great civilizations and things other than Africans. That's kind of how it is. And now, even in Egypt, they'll say that aliens did it before they credit Africans. So I definitely feel you on that. So, Vanessa, thank you for being with us. Tell us about any upcoming events you got, any new projects. I know you sent us a great article. Make sure you guys go check it out on iblackpharaoh.com, on our blog site. What you got new coming up?
So the article that I sent you, and that I thank you for posting, is part of a book that I'm working on. So I am, right now, the way that we understand the history of Egyptology as a university discipline, it has no voices in it of people of African descent in America, and that is wrong. I have found so many fascinating relationships, like the one in the article I write about between W.B. Du Bois and a very famous British Egyptologist named Flinders Petrie. Egyptologists had no idea that Petrie and Du Bois knew each other, that they were writing letters to one another. So I have found quite a few relationships like that involving people like Booker T. Washington, Marcus Garvey, Alain Locke, a woman named Pauline Hopkins. And all of these people were engaging with Egyptologists who were white, either professors in the US or professors in Europe. They were engaging with the discipline of Egyptology, and they were doing this work that we were talking about putting Egypt back in Africa. But none of these scholars of African descent are part of the way that the history of Egyptology as an academic discipline today. So I'm working on this book that talks about all these relationships so that we can now change how we understand Egyptology, and we can bring these voices of African scholars into our understanding of how the discipline grew up in the United States. So that's my big project. So that article was sort of like a part of this much larger book that I'm working on. I go around, I give talks on it that helps me sort of get through the writing process. It helps me hear what's interesting to people, what's unclear to people, what I need to flesh out a little more. So yeah, so that's my big project that I'm working on.
Cool. And if someone wanted to contact you, what is the best means to contact you?
So I am not on social media, but I have a page on the website, which is academia.edu. And this is where I load articles that I've published when the publisher lets me load them online, because sometimes they have restrictions about that. I'll post links to talks I've given if the talks are taped. And so people can actually message me through my webpage on academia.edu, and I'll get it as an email, and I'll respond.
Okay, cool. I had a struggle trying to find Ms. Davies as well, but I found you. So we are so glad to have you. We are happy to have you on the show. I love what you're doing. Please keep doing what you're doing. And exactly what we've been talking about is the awareness that the world is on today, is people looking at African people and projecting some sort of fear or misunderstanding. And this has also led to this miseducation. But you, before all of this stuff, and I have to commend you and Dr. Shally Aston as well, that and the many others, of course, that we mentioned earlier, that have taken a stand on this, even before this whole racial issue came about. So I thank you for your diligence and what you're doing, and please keep doing what you're doing. And if you can, tune in next week to see what Dr. Ashton has to say.
Cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate, being asked to talk with you today. I appreciate your support. I will definitely tune in next week. Sally Ann had a huge impact on my career. I met her first when I was a very young grad student, and I think she's amazing. And yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about my work to your listeners.
Thank you. That was PhD Vanessa Davies. She came through the show and kept her word. We love people who keep their word. They're honest. They tell the truth. They speak facts. They don't come into Egyptology with an agenda. We love these type of people. We're going to go to a quick break, and then we're going to come back. We're going to talk about Hatshepsut, what we talked about a little bit about on the show today. So we're going to come back after this.
So I'm not here this afternoon as a Republican, nor as a Democrat. Not as a Mason, nor as an elf. Not as a Protestant, nor a Catholic. Not as a Christian, nor a Jew. Not as a Baptist, nor a Methodist. In fact, not even as an American. Because if I was an American, the problem that confronts our people today wouldn't even exist. So I have to stand here today as what I was when I was born, a black man. Before there was any such thing as a Republican or a Democrat, we were black. Before there was any such thing as a Mason or an elf, we were black. Before there was any such thing as a Jew or a Christian, we were black people. In fact, before there was any such place as America, we were black. And after America has long passed from the scene, there will still be black people. I'm going to tell you like it really is. Every election year, these politicians are sent up here to pacify. They're sent here and set up here by the white man. This is what they do. They send drugs in Harlem down here to pacify us. They send alcohol down here to pacify us. They send prostitution down here to pacify us. Why, you can't even get drugs in Harlem without the white man's permission. You can't get prostitution in Harlem without the white man's permission.